She was accused of stealing, and she never stole a thing in her life. One lie. That's all it took to strip Clara Whitmore of everything she had built, her job, her name, her future. Cast out into a Wyoming winter with nothing but a worn travel bag and a recipe book held together by a single piece of string, she had two choices: disappear quietly or survive. She chose to survive. But surviving meant walking into the home of a man who didn't want her there, into a house full of grief, silence, and a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. This is her story. Stay until the end, because the moment that broke her was not the accusation. It was something far worse. If you're new here, subscribe and become part of our family, so you never miss the stories that matter. And while you're watching, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The stagecoach pulled into Copper Creek just after 2 in the afternoon, and nobody came out to meet it. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Back in Cheyenne, even in the rough neighborhoods she'd passed through, a stagecoach arriving meant something. A handful of people near the post office, a merchant leaning out a doorway, children chasing the wheels through the mud. Here, the coach rolled to a stop in front of a weathered building with a faded sign that read, "General Store and Mail," and the street simply absorbed it. A dog lifted its head from a porch. A woman carrying a basket glanced once and kept walking. Clara waited until the driver called out before she stood. Her legs had gone stiff somewhere back near the river crossing, and she pressed her palm against the side of the coach to steady herself as she stepped down. The mud beneath her boots was thick and dark and smelled of iron and wet horse. She had 43 cents in her coat pocket, a travel bag with one change of clothes, and a recipe book wrapped in burlap that had belonged to her mother. That was the complete inventory of Clara Whitmore at age 27. The driver dropped her bag in the mud without looking at her. "This is it," he said, already climbing back up. She picked up her own bag. 3 weeks earlier, Clara had been standing in the kitchen of the Meridian Hotel in Cheyenne, where she'd worked for almost 2 years. She knew that kitchen the way she knew her own hands, the way the south-facing window caught the morning light, the exact spot on the floor that creaked if you stepped too far right, the temperament of the old cast-iron stove that ran too hot on the left side and needed careful watching. She'd worked her way up from washing dishes to running breakfast service, and the head cook, a stout German man named Hoffman, had told her twice that she had real talent. It was the closest thing she'd had to a life since her mother died. It ended on a Tuesday. She'd been the last one in the kitchen that evening, finishing inventory, when Mr. Beaumont, the hotel manager, walked in with 2 of his staff and told her not to move. A guest on the 3rd floor had reported money missing from her room, $40. The guest, a Mrs. Edna Farlow of Denver, had said she'd seen a young woman with red hair near her door. Clara's hair was dark brown. It didn't matter. "Mrs. Farlow is very specific," Beaumont said, and the way he said it made it clear the conversation was already finished. His hands were clasped in front of him. His expression was the practiced neutrality of a man who had made this kind of decision before and slept fine afterward. "I've never been to the 3rd floor," Clara said. "I don't have access. You know I don't have access. We've spoken to the other staff. Then they told you I was in the kitchen all evening." "They told me you were mostly in the kitchen." He paused. "Mrs. Farlow is a regular guest and a personal acquaintance of the hotel owner. I'm sure you understand." She understood perfectly. She was escorted out through the back door. No hearing, no investigation. Hoffman passed her in the corridor and looked away, which hurt worse than anything Beaumont had said. By morning, word had spread through the hiring network the way things spread in a town like Cheyenne: fast, distorted, and permanent. She tried 3 restaurants and 2 households. One door was closed in her face before she finished her sentence. Another woman listened politely and then said the position had been filled. Clara stood on the street afterward, knowing the position had not been filled. She had $4 and some change when she finally sat down at the edge of the train depot and read the notice pinned to the community board. Position available. Cook and housekeeper needed. Remote ranch, Copper Creek territory. Room and board provided. References not required. Inquire. Varden, Box 7, Copper Creek. References not required. She read that line twice. Then she spent most of her remaining money on the stagecoach fare. Quote, the woman behind the counter at the general store looked at her with the particular caution of a small-town woman who had learned to read strangers quickly and trust them slowly. I'm looking for the Varden Ranch, Clara said. I rode ahead. I'm the new cook. The woman's expression shifted. Not to warmth exactly, but to recognition. Elias Varden hired you? He offered the position by mail. I accepted. The woman studied her a moment longer than was comfortable. He's not an easy man, she said finally. Just so you know. I've worked for difficult people. The woman wrote down directions on the back of a brown paper bag. It's about 6 miles east. You'll need someone to take you out. My boy Thomas can drive you, long as you don't mind the wagon. Clara didn't mind the wagon. Thomas turned out to be about 16, with a gap in his front teeth and the relaxed silence of someone who didn't feel the need to fill empty space with noise. Clara liked him immediately. They rode for about half an hour through flat land that opened gradually into hills, the sky above them the color of old pewter, heavy with clouds that hadn't decided yet what they intended to do. You know the Vardens? Clara asked after a while. Thomas shrugged. Some. What are they like? The children, I mean. He thought about it. Quiet, he said. Since their mama died, they got quiet. He glanced at her sideways. Mr. Varden, too. He doesn't talk much. My ma says he used to before. How long ago did she pass? 2 winters back. Fever. Thomas looked at the road ahead. It was bad. Clara didn't ask anything else. The ranch house came into view around a bend in the road, and it was smaller than she'd imagined. A single-story structure with a covered porch, solid built but plain, the kind of place that had been built for function and had never had the luxury of becoming anything more. There were 2 outbuildings, a barn that looked reasonably kept, and a fence line that needed work on the eastern side. A boy was sitting on the porch steps when the wagon pulled up. He was maybe 8 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and serious eyes that tracked her approach with the unblinking attention of a child who'd learned to assess things carefully. He didn't stand up, didn't wave. You the cook? He said. I am, Clara said. I'm Clara. What's your name? Benjamin? Nice to meet you, Benjamin. He considered her. You're not as old as the last one. How old was the last one? Old? He paused. She left after 2 weeks. Clara stepped down from the wagon and retrieved her bag. Why did she leave? Benjamin looked at the door. Papa scared her off, I think. He wasn't meaning to. He stopped. He doesn't know how to talk to people much anymore. Thomas lifted his hat to her from the wagon, clicked at the horses, and headed back the way they'd come. Clara stood in front of the house with her bag in her hand and looked at the boy on the steps. Is your father home? She asked. He's in the barn. Benjamin finally stood, as though some invisible formality had been satisfied. Noah's inside. He won't talk to you right away. He's 11, and he thinks he's the man of the house since Papa's always working. That's a lot of responsibility for an 11-year-old. Benjamin shrugged. He chose it. Elias Varden emerged from the barn about 10 minutes later, while Clara was standing in the kitchen taking stock of what she'd been left to work with. She heard the door open and felt the temperature of the room shift before she turned around. That particular sensation of someone large moving into a contained space. He was not what she expected, though she'd have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that came from years of actual work rather than anything cultivated. His face was weathered and blunt-featured, the face of a man who'd spent a long time outdoors not thinking about his face. He was maybe 35, 36. His eyes were the flat gray of the sky outside, and they moved over her with the same measuring quality his son had shown, except without any of the child's tentative openness. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. Miss Whitmore, he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was more like a confirmation. Mr. Varden? He came inside and set his hat on a hook near the door. He didn't offer his hand. He moved to the center of the room and looked at her with the directness of a man who had decided at some point that social cushioning was a waste of time. "I'll be clear with you about what this is," he said. "I need someone to cook and keep this house in order. I have 2 sons who need fed and clothed and kept out of trouble. That's the whole of it. This is not—" He paused, chose his words. "I'm not looking for anything beyond that. The last woman who came thought the arrangement was something different and left when she understood it wasn't." Clara met his eyes. What did she think it was? Something moved in his expression, almost a surprise that she'd asked. She thought she'd be welcomed as part of the family. She had ideas about how the house should be run, how I should handle things with the boys. And you didn't want her input. I didn't hire her for her input. Clara set down the burlap-wrapped recipe book on the kitchen table. "What wages are you offering?" He named a figure. It was modest but fair for the territory. "And the room?" "Off the back of the kitchen, small but private. Boys won't bother you." "When do you want me to start?" He blinked. He'd clearly expected something, some negotiation or a question about the terms, or perhaps a reaction to his deliberate coldness. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll start tonight," Clara said. "Have you all eaten?" A pause. "No." "Then I'll start tonight." She found potatoes, a smoked ham hock, dried beans that had been sitting too long but were still good, onions, and half a bag of flour. She found a pan that needed seasoning and a cast-iron pot that was fine. The stove was the same model as the one in the Meridian Hotel kitchen. She recognized its particular quirks immediately. Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway around 6 o'clock. He was taller than his brother, thin, with a watchfulness about him that reminded Clara of a hawk. He looked at her with 11-year-old severity and said nothing. "You can sit if you want," Clara said, stirring the pot. "I'm not hungry." "That's fine. You don't have to eat. You can just stand there looking at me if you prefer." He said nothing to that, but he didn't leave either. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her move around the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. After a few minutes, he said, "What are you making?" "Bean soup with ham, and biscuits if the flour's still good." She looked at him. "Is it?" He was surprised to be asked. "I think so. Mama used to make biscuits." Clara didn't make a performance of that. She just nodded. "Then I'll make biscuits." She caught him watching the way she cut the lard into the flour, the particular motion of it, and she didn't comment on it. She just kept working. When the food was ready, she set the table for 4, called out once. Benjamin appeared immediately. Noah drifted in from the doorway like he was doing her a favor. Elias came from somewhere deeper in the house and sat at the head of the table and looked at the food like he was trying to find something wrong with it. Nobody spoke for a while. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. The wind pushed against the windows. Then Benjamin said, "These are good biscuits." Elias didn't look up. "Don't talk with your mouth full." Benjamin swallowed. "These are good biscuits," he said again. Clara kept her face straight. "Thank you, Benjamin." Noah ate 2 helpings of soup and said nothing, but he ate 2 helpings of soup, and Clara noticed. After dinner, Elias pushed back his chair, looked at the table, at the empty bowls, the half-finished plate of biscuits, the 2 boys sitting with the particular looseness of children who'd eaten well. And then he looked at Clara. "It was a good meal," he said. 1 sentence, flat and without decoration. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. No. Clara washed the dishes alone and put the kitchen in order and then sat in her small room behind the kitchen with her mother's recipe book in her lap. The room had a narrow bed, a window that looked out onto nothing but dark land and a slice of sky, and a hook on the wall where she hung her coat. The floor was clean but cold. She opened the recipe book to no particular page and looked at her mother's handwriting. The round, uneven letters of a woman who'd taught herself to write as an adult, careful and effortful, and absolutely her own. Bean soup, biscuits, applesauce cake, Sunday bread. Her mother had built a life out of simple things, out of keeping people fed and warm and not complaining too loudly about what was missing. Clara had always thought that was a kind of quiet defeat. Sitting in this small, cold room at the edge of the Wyoming frontier, she wasn't so sure anymore. She was 43 cents poorer than she'd been that morning, Her name was ruined in Cheyenne, and she had taken a job with a man who'd made it explicitly clear she was not welcome as a person, only as a function. But Noah had eaten 2 helpings, and Benjamin had said the biscuits were good. She closed the book and put out the lamp. It wasn't much, but it was a place to start. The first morning, Clara woke before anyone else. That was habit, not virtue. In hotel kitchens, you learned early that the cook who arrived last set the tone for a bad day, and the lesson had taken root in her bones years ago. She dressed in the dark, found the kitchen by feel and memory, and had the stove going and coffee heating before the sky outside had decided to do anything more than hint at gray. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the land while the water came to heat. The ranch stretched east in the pre-dawn darkness, flat near the house, then rising into hills that were really just suggestions at this hour, shapes against a slightly lighter sky. It was stark country, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they don't care whether you appreciate them or not. She heard Elias before she saw him, heavy footsteps from somewhere toward the front of the house, then the particular sound of a man who has lived alone long enough that he stopped trying to be quiet in his own home. He appeared in the kitchen doorway already dressed, already wearing his coat, and stopped when he saw the lit stove and the coffee. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "I didn't know what time you rose," Clara said. "I guessed early." "5," he said. "It's 1:45. He moved to the table and sat down heavily, and she poured him a cup without being asked. He wrapped both hands around it the way a man does when he's been cold for a long time, and the warmth is almost painful. "I'll have eggs and bread ready in 20 minutes, she said. "Will the boys eat before school?" "There's no school this time of year. Teacher comes through in the spring and fall." He drank. "Benjamin will eat anything you put in front of him. Noah eats when he remembers to." "I'll make sure he remembers." Elias looked up at her over the rim of the cup. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite curiosity. Something cautious, like a man watching a bridge he's not sure will hold his weight. "You don't need to manage them," he said. "Just cook." "I can do both," Clara said, and cracked the first egg. He didn't answer, but he sat there and drank his coffee and didn't leave, which she decided to count as something. The eggs were nothing special. She had no butter yet, only lard, and the bread was yesterday's biscuits warmed on the stove top. But she salted the eggs correctly, and she didn't burn the bread, and when Benjamin came shuffling in at 5:30 with his hair going in 3 directions, and sat down and ate without complaint, she felt the quiet satisfaction of a job that was small and honest and hers. Noah came in at 6, looked at the plate she'd set for him, and sat down without a word. He ate the eggs in about 4 bites, standing up, and then started moving toward the door. "You can sit," Claire said. "I'm done." "I know. Sit anyway." He turned and looked at her with the flat, evaluating stare that, on an 11-year-old, was almost funny. "Why?" "Because it's breakfast, and you should sit for it." She poured him more coffee, half hot water, the way she'd seen some ranch families do it for older children, and set it in front of the chair. 5 minutes, then you can go do whatever you were going to do. He sat. He drank the coffee with the expression of someone performing a significant concession. But he sat. That was the first morning. The days that followed were harder than she let on. The work itself wasn't beyond her. She'd run busier kitchens than this. But a hotel kitchen had rhythm and structure and other people. Here, the cooking was only part of it. The house needed attention in ways that had been ignored for 2 winters, and Claire could see, in the dusty corners and the windows that hadn't been properly cleaned, and the curtains that had come half down on one side of the sitting room and just stayed that way, the specific shape of grief. Not poverty, not laziness, grief. The kind that makes a person look at a loose curtain rod and simply not have the energy to care about it. She didn't touch the curtains right away. That felt like overstepping. She cleaned the kitchen first, properly, the way it should have been done months ago, scrubbing the shelves and oiling the cast iron and going through the dry goods to throw out what had gone bad and take stock of what was needed. She found a list she thought Mrs. Varden had written, tucked behind the flour tin. A shopping list in small, neat handwriting. Cornmeal, vanilla, dried cherries if they have them. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket and didn't mention it to anyone. By the end of the first week, she had the kitchen running the way she needed it to run. By the end of the second, she'd worked her way into the rest of the house. quietly, without making announcements about it, cleaning in the early afternoons when Elias was out and the boys were occupied with whatever boys occupied themselves with on a ranch in the late fall. She fixed the curtain rod. She swept the porch. She found a basket of mending in the back room that had been sitting there long enough that some of it was probably no longer mendable, and she sorted through it and fixed what she could. Elias didn't comment on any of this. He came in, ate, went back out. Sometimes she heard him working late in the barn, sounds carried clearly out here, and she got in the habit of leaving something warm on the back of the stove. Not a full meal, just something. Soup, usually, or the remains of dinner with the lid kept on. She noticed he always ate it. She noticed a lot of things she didn't mention. She noticed that Benjamin, who talked to her freely about almost everything, went quiet whenever his mother was obliquely referenced. She noticed that Noah had a habit of standing in the doorway of rooms rather than entering them, as though he were always deciding whether to commit. She noticed that Elias, despite his stated preference for being left alone, had a tell. When something around the house had been fixed or cleaned, he would stop and look at it for a moment, not saying anything, just looking, and then move on. It was the closest thing he seemed to have to gratitude. The groceries became a negotiation she hadn't anticipated. When she asked Elias for money to purchase what the kitchen needed, he gave her a flat amount and told her to make it work. She did. But she also made it clear, the second time, that certain things were not optional. "I need more salt and baking powder," she said, "and I need lard and I need potatoes. What I have won't last through next week. You've got salt. I have almost no salt." He looked at her like she was arguing about something trivial. "How much can you possibly go through in a week? Come cook for 3 people every day and then ask me that." Something crossed his face. She wasn't sure if it was irritation or something more like amusement, quickly suppressed. He reached into his coat and gave her money without further comment. She was learning the edges of him, where you could push and where you couldn't. He didn't like being questioned about the ranch, like his decisions about the land, the cattle, the structure of his days. He didn't like suggestions about the boys' routines, which were loose to the point of non-existent, though she'd found ways to create structure in the kitchen at least, which bled into the rest of things. He didn't like being thanked or acknowledged for the small things he did, which Clara had started noticing more and more. He chopped extra wood and stacked it near the kitchen door. He oiled a hinge on the back gate that had been screaming every time she went to the well. He appeared one morning while she was struggling with a stuck window that hadn't been opened in months and, without being asked, crossed the room and opened it in one motion with the flat of his hand. "Thank you," she said. "It was stuck," he said, and left. She told herself it was just a man maintaining his property. But sometimes, when she was honest with herself, she wasn't entirely sure that's all it was. Benjamin found his way into the kitchen somewhere around the second week. Not obviously, not by walking in and announcing himself. He started appearing at the edges, the way cats do, drawn by warmth and smell, and the particular comfort of a space where something good was happening. He'd stand near the doorway and watch her work. Then he started asking questions. "What does that do?" This about the way she was browning flour in a dry pan. "It changes the flavor, makes it nuttier, less raw. Can you taste the difference?" "Here." She scraped a small bit onto a spoon and held it out. He tasted it with the seriousness of a boy who didn't want to be fooled. "Yeah," he said, surprised. "That's different. Most things you do to food make a difference. That's the point." He thought about that. "Mama used to let me stir things." Clara handed him the wooden spoon. "Then stir." He came back the next day. And the day after that. He wasn't especially skilled. He had no patience for tasks that required fine motor control and a short attention span for anything that didn't change quickly. But he was genuinely curious, which was better. Curiosity in Clara's experience was worth more than skill in the long run. Noah was harder. He was civil to her now in a way he hadn't been the first day, but civil was as far as it went. He ate well. He answered when spoken to. He helped carry firewood when she asked and didn't complain about it. But there was a wall behind his eyes that he'd built himself and maintained carefully, and Clara had enough sense not to throw herself against it. She found a different approach. She started leaving things out. Not food, something else. She had 2 books in her travel bag. She wasn't sure why she'd brought them, habit probably, or the faint hope that she'd find time to read. One was a basic agricultural almanac, and the other was a novel she'd had since she was young, worn at the spine. She left the almanac on the kitchen table one morning, not pointed toward where Noah sat, just there, open to a page about winter crop management. 2 days later, she noticed it had been moved, opened further. She didn't say anything about it. The following week, Noah came into the kitchen where she was working and stood in his usual doorway position. She kept working. The almanac says November frost can kill the rootstock if the ground isn't banked right, he said. I don't know much about ranching, Clara said, but I'd think that's your father's concern. He knows. He banked them last week. A pause. I just thought it was interesting. It is interesting. She looked at him. You want to learn about the land? He shrugged. It was a shrug that meant yes. There's more in that almanac about soil and pasture management in the back half, the ranching sections. She turned back to the pot. Might be worth reading. He was in the kitchen chair with the almanac 20 minutes later, and he stayed for almost an hour, and Clara kept her back to him and cooked and didn't make it into anything. When Elias came in that evening and saw Noah at the kitchen table reading, something moved through his face. Fast, barely there, but Clara caught it. It was pain, she thought, or something close to it. The pain of seeing something normal, something that should have been normal all along, and being reminded how long it had been absent. He sat down heavily across from his son. What are you reading? He asked. Noah looked up. The almanac. She had it. Elias's eyes moved to Clara, who was at the stove and not looking at either of them. The section on winter pasture management, Noah said. I had some questions. Ask me, Elias said. There was something rough in his voice, but not unkind. I know more than any almanac. Noah looked at him for a moment, the long evaluating look that, on Noah, could have meant anything. Then he said, Okay. Clara stirred the pot and said nothing. The argument started in the third week, which she supposed was roughly when they'd become comfortable enough with each other for honesty to come in. You used too much wood this week, Elias said one morning. He'd come in cold and sharp-voiced, and she could tell before he'd finished the sentence that he'd been out arguing with the land and had brought it inside to argue with her instead. I used what the cooking required, Clara said. There are ways to cook that don't run through half a cord. I'm sure there are. They generally involve worse food. She didn't look up from what she was doing. If you'd like me to serve inferior meals, I can do that. It'll be cheaper. Silence. She heard him cross his arms. I'm not saying inferior. I'm saying efficient. I am efficient. Efficient doesn't mean cold. Another silence, longer this time. Then he went outside and she heard him splitting more wood. A lot of it, with the particular violence of a man who needed to do something physical to end an argument with himself. When she went to bring in more firewood that afternoon, there was a fresh stack by the kitchen door twice as large as what she'd used. She carried it inside without comment. It was not a smooth arrangement. There were days she found herself standing at the kitchen window late at night, too tired to go to her room, thinking about Cheyenne and about what her life had looked like before all of this. Smaller, yes, and less hers, but also less complicated, less full of things she couldn't quite name. There was a particular evening, about a month in, when she dropped the large ceramic mixing bowl that had been on the kitchen shelf. She'd been tired, her grip was off, and it hit the floor and broke into 4 pieces. She stood looking at it, and the tiredness of the month just sat on her. The early mornings and the late nights and Elias's silences and the careful work of drawing Noah out and the loneliness of the little room and the grief that hung over everything in the house like smoke you eventually stopped smelling. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. Her eyes were hot. What broke? Benjamin appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound. The bowl. She crouched down and started picking up the pieces. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Benjamin crouched beside her without being asked and helped gather the pieces. He was quiet for a moment, doing it carefully, and then he said, We had a bowl like that. Mama had it a long time. Clara looked at him. Papa will probably not even notice, Benjamin said. He didn't say it to be comforting, just as honest reporting. He doesn't notice things like bowls. I'll tell him anyway, Clara said. It wasn't mine to break. Benjamin stood and put his pieces into her hand. He gave her the look of a child who has thought about something and decided to say it. I think he'd rather it was you than nobody, he said. At least you're here. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. Clara stood in the kitchen with the broken pieces of the bowl in her hands and stood there a moment before she put them in the scrap pail. She told Elias about the bowl at dinner. Flat and direct, the way she'd learned he responded to best. I broke the large mixing bowl this afternoon. I'd like to replace it. I can put it toward my wages if that's easier. He looked at her. Was it my wife's bowl? I don't know whose it was. It was on the shelf. A pause. He looked at the table. No, he said finally. Don't put it toward wages. He picked up his fork. It's just a bowl. She thought about what Benjamin had said. At least you're here. She looked across the table at Noah, who was trying to cut a piece of potato into equal thirds for reasons that were probably entirely private to him. At Benjamin, who was eating with his usual focused commitment. At Elias, who was looking at his plate with the expression of a man working his way through thoughts he couldn't quite close. She hadn't come here to matter to these people. She'd come because she had 43 cents and nowhere else to go. But things had a way of becoming more than what you bargained for, and she was starting to understand that the question wasn't whether this place needed her. The question was what she was going to do about needing it back. Outside, the temperature was dropping. The hills to the east had taken on the particular gray-white look that came before snow. In the barn, she could hear one of the horses moving restlessly in its stall. The first real winter weather was coming. She started on the dishes, and the house creaked around her in the wind, and from the sitting room she could hear, faintly, improbably, the sound of Elias's low voice reading something aloud, and then Noah asking a question, and then the silence of a man who was very carefully learning to talk to his son again. Clara kept washing the dishes. She didn't know what any of this was going to become, but she knew it was alive, this house. For the first time in 2 years, it was alive, and she was the one who had carried the heat in. The snow came on a Thursday. Clara had been watching the sky for 2 days before it arrived. There was a particular quality to the light in the afternoons leading up to it, flat and white and somehow pressurized, the way the air gets when something large is gathering itself. She'd grown up far enough north to know that kind of sky. It wasn't a passing weather system. It was a decision. She mentioned it to Elias on Wednesday evening, when he came in for dinner, and she saw him looking at the horizon with the same expression she'd been wearing all afternoon. How bad do you think? She asked. He pulled off his gloves and set them on the hook. Bad enough. I've seen that sky before. He sat down and looked at his hands for a moment. I need to move the younger cattle to the south pasture before it hits. The shelter there is better. When will you go? Tomorrow morning, early. She put food on the table. Benjamin was already in his chair and Noah came in from outside, still wearing his coat, smelling of cold air and hay. The four of them ate in the way they'd fallen into over the past weeks. Not exactly comfortable, not exactly family, but something that occupied the space between those two things. Can I help with the cattle? Noah asked. Elias looked at him across the table. You know how to move cattle in weather? I've watched you enough times. Watching and doing are different things. Noah's jaw set in the way it did when he was about to push back, and Clara kept her eyes on her plate. This was not hers to intervene in. She'd learned that particular lesson in the second week, when she'd tried to smooth over a disagreement between them, and Elias had looked at her with a flatness that made it clear, wordlessly but entirely, that she'd stepped somewhere she shouldn't. I'm not a child, Noah said. I know how old you are. Then let me help. Elias ate for a moment without answering. Then he said, You can come as far as the south fence line. You do what I say, and nothing else. Noah nodded. It was the most carefully neutral nod Clara had ever seen on a boy trying to look like he hadn't just gotten what he wanted. After dinner, while she was cleaning up, Elias lingered at the table longer than usual. He had his coffee, and he was looking at the window, which showed nothing but black and the occasional flicker of something that might have been the beginning of flurries. If it gets bad, he said without turning around, keep them inside. I know, Clara said. I mean it. Don't let Benjamin talk you into going to the barn. He'll want to check on the horses. He always wants to check on the horses. I'll manage Benjamin. A pause. The woodpile on the east side should be enough for 2 days. There's more in the barn if you need it, but only go to the barn if you absolutely... Elias. She said his name with enough directness that he turned. It was the first time she'd used his first name without the Mr. attached, and she noticed him notice it. I'll keep them safe, she said. Go do what you need to do. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and took his coffee and went. The storm arrived the next morning before Elias and Noah had come back in from the south pasture. Clara had been up since 4:30. She'd barely slept, which she wouldn't have admitted, and by 8 o'clock the sky had gone from gray to white to the particular blind white of a blizzard in full motion. The wind came first as a sound, a low sustained howl that found every gap in the walls, and then as a force she could feel through the floorboards when she stood near the door. She put more wood on the fire and started heating water. Benjamin appeared at the kitchen door at 8:30, already dressed, his hair pressed flat on one side from sleep. He looked out the kitchen window and then at her. Where's Papa? Still out. He'll be back when the cattle are settled. She said it steadily, the way you say things to children when you need them to not panic so you can afford to panic slightly on your own. Benjamin looked at the window again. The snow was coming sideways now, driven by a wind that had stopped sounding like weather and started sounding like something with intent. He should be back, Benjamin said. He knows this land better than the land knows itself. Go wash your face. Benjamin went, but she saw him look at the window again before he left the kitchen, and she recognized the look. It was the look of a child who'd already lost one parent and knew that the world was not in the habit of making exceptions for that fact. Noah and Elias came in around 9. Clara heard them before she saw them. The stamp of boots on the porch, voices low and urgent, the specific sound of people moving fast in from cold. She had the door open before they knocked. They were both covered in snow. Elias was moving fine, but there was ice in his beard, and his face had the particular tight blankness of a man operating on function and not much else. Noah was shivering hard enough that his teeth were audible. She stepped back and let them in and shut the door against the wind, which pushed back hard. Strip the outer layers, she said. She was already at the stove pulling the kettle forward. Both of you. Noah pulled off his coat with clumsy fingers, and she took it from him and hung it without ceremony. His hands were red and stiff. She wrapped them in a dish towel, not soft, not gentle exactly, just quick and practical, and pressed them between her palms for a moment and then made him hold the towel himself, while she poured hot water into a basin. Elias had his own coat off and was standing with his back to the fire, his jaw set against the shivering he was clearly trying not to show. How bad is it out there? She asked. Getting worse? He watched her move around the kitchen. South pasture is covered. I got all the younger stock in the shelter before it closed in. He paused. We had about 10 minutes. Where'd it catch you? Between the shelter and the tree line. We had to walk the horses. Visibility was... He stopped, looked at Noah, who was sitting at the table with his hands in the warm water basin, eyes down. It was close, Elias said, quieter. Closer than I'd have liked. Clara put coffee in front of him without asking. He took it with both hands. I told him to turn back at the fence line, Elias said. His voice had the controlled steadiness of a man working something out. He didn't. Noah kept his eyes on the water. You would have needed help with the gate. I would have managed. The latch was frozen. A silence that had several things in it. He's right, Elias said finally to Clara, not to Noah. The latch was frozen. He looked at his son then, a long look, complicated, the look of a father who was angry and afraid and grateful all at once and didn't have language for any of it. Don't do that again, he said. Noah looked up. Which part? Disobeying me. Okay? I mean it. I know. A pause. I'm not sorry, though. Elias looked like he was going to say something sharp. Then something in his face shifted very slightly, and instead he just turned back to his coffee. Warm up, he said. Both of you. By noon, the blizzard had made its intentions undeniable. The wind was continuous and violent, and the snow had eliminated everything beyond the porch. The barn was invisible. The fence posts were gone, and the world had contracted to the four walls of the house and the fire that Clara had been feeding carefully all morning. She'd moved into a particular mode she recognized from hard kitchens and difficult circumstances. The part of her brain that stopped thinking about what she was feeling and started cataloging what needed to be done. More wood. Keep the stove going. Inventory what food they had if this lasted longer than a day. Check the windows on the north side for drafts and stuff them with rags if needed. Keep the boys occupied. The boys occupied turned out to be the hardest item on the list. By early afternoon, Benjamin was orbiting the kitchen with the restless energy of a child who'd exhausted his ability to be still. He'd rearranged the dry goods on the shelf, looked out every window at least 9 times, and asked twice whether the horses were okay in the barn. "The horses are fine," Claire said. "Your father put extra hay in this morning." "How do you know?" "Because he's a rancher and he thought ahead and he put extra hay in. Now come here." She put him to work. This was her standard remedy for Benjamin. Give him something to do with his hands and his brain followed. She walked him through making bread from scratch. Not the simple biscuits she'd been making, but actual bread. The risen kind that required patience and timing and produced something worth waiting for. He'd never done it before and was immediately skeptical about the waiting. "It just sits there for an hour?" "It has to rise." "What's it doing while it rises?" "Working. You can't always see the important things happening." He poked the dough. "It doesn't feel like anything's happening." "Most things don't while they're happening." He gave her the look he gave her when she said something that sounded like more than it was, and he wasn't sure whether to take it at face value. She handed him the damp cloth to cover the bowl. Noah had disappeared into the sitting room with the almanac and a different book Clara hadn't seen him pick up. When she glanced in, she recognized it as her novel, the one she'd had since she was young. She almost said something. Then she didn't. If he'd taken it, he was reading it, and that was fine. Elias spent the early afternoon checking every door and window in the house with the thoroughness of a man who needed something to do besides sit still. Clara could hear him moving from room to room, the particular cadence of it, checking, pressing, making sure. When he came back through the kitchen, he stopped. "North window in the back room has a gap," he said. "I stuffed it with a rag this morning." He looked at her. "I checked the windows at 9, she said. "There are rags in 2 of them." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't need to do that. The house needs it done." "That's not—" He stopped, started over. "That's not your job." "What is my job exactly? Because it keeps being more than cooking, and I keep doing it anyway." It came out more directly than she'd intended. She turned back to the stove and let the silence sit there. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd left. Then he said, "I appreciate it," in a voice that had the sound of a man forcing a door that had been stuck for a long time. She didn't turn around. "The bread will be done in about an hour. I'll put soup on." She heard him move to the table and sit down. Not leave, just sit. He sat in the kitchen for the rest of the afternoon. He didn't talk much. He never talked much. But he was there, reading something he'd brought in from the other room, or just sitting with his hands around a cup, or watching the window with the focused expression of a man monitoring something he had no control over and hadn't yet accepted that fact about. And the kitchen was warm, and the bread was rising, and Benjamin was asking questions about yeast that Clara was answering while she prepped the soup, and eventually Noah drifted in and sat down at the table across from his father with her novel and read without preamble. For a while nobody said anything. Then Benjamin said, "Papa, what's the worst blizzard you ever saw?" Elias looked at him. It was the kind of question a child asks without knowing it might cost someone something to answer. 84, he said after a moment. 2 years after I came out here. 4 days. We lost 12 head. Did you get stuck? For 2 days, in the barn. He paused. It wasn't bad. I had enough food and there were the animals. He looked at the window. Being with animals in a storm is not the worst situation you can be in. Were you scared? Noah looked up from the book at that. Clara kept her attention on the soup. No, Elias said, and then slower. Maybe a little. It's the not knowing how long that gets to you. Benjamin nodded like this was important information. I'm scared sometimes, he said, when you're out late and it gets dark and you haven't come back. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Elias looked at his younger son, and something in his face did the complicated thing Clara had seen it do before, the way it moved towards something and then got very still. "I always come back," he said. "I know." Benjamin picked at the edge of the table. "I just think about it." "Benjamin, it's okay." Benjamin looked up, and his expression was entirely transparent in the way children's expressions are when they're telling the truth. "I just wanted to say it. Clara says it's better to say it than not." Elias looked at Clara. She kept her back to him and stirred the soup and did not apologize for this. "She's right," Elias said finally. His voice was rough. "It's better to say it." The bread came out at 5 o'clock, and when Clara pulled it from the oven and set it on the table, it was as close to perfect as bread she'd made in a long time, golden crusted, dense with the smell of something warm and right. Benjamin immediately wanted to cut it. "Give it 10 minutes to rest," she said. "Why does bread need to rest?" "Because everything does." Noah reached over without looking up from the book and flicked his brother's hand away from the bread. 10 minutes, he said. Benjamin looked at him. This was new. Noah participating in the ordinary texture of things, inserting himself into a moment just because he was in it, not because he was required to be. Clara registered it without making it into anything. Elias looked at his two sons over the bread and the soup and the lit stove, and something moved through his face that was there and gone too fast to name. Night came early, as it always did in winter, and hard, and the blizzard didn't relent. By 8 o'clock, the wind was worse than it had been at midday. The sounds the house made in response were constant, creaks and sighs, and the particular groan of a structure bracing itself. The windows on the north side were opaque with ice. Clara put the boys to bed at 9. This had become her territory by default. Elias was always still up at that hour, usually somewhere in the house doing something that needed doing, and she'd simply fallen into the habit of seeing the boys through the end of the day. Benjamin went without much argument. Noah went with the dignity of someone who'd decided not to make it an issue. After that, it was just her and Elias in the storm. She sat at the kitchen table and worked on mending. She'd taken over the basket from the back room weeks ago, and there was always something in it. Elias moved in and out for a while, checking the fire in the main room, looking at the windows. Around 10, he sat down across from her. They didn't talk for a while. The wind made that feel less strange than it might have otherwise. "How long do you think?" she asked. "Could be another full day." He looked at the window. "Could be more. I've seen them run 3 days." She kept sewing. The needle was finer than she'd have liked, and the thread kept catching, but she worked through it. "Are you worried about the cattle?" she asked. "Yes." He didn't elaborate. He said it plainly, the way he said things he wasn't going to perform about. "What about the ones in the south shelter?" "They should be fine. The ones I'm thinking about are the 2 cows that calved late. They're in the main barn, but they're young, and—" He stopped. "There's always something." "Is there anything you can do tonight?" "No." "Then you might as well be in here." He looked at her across the table. It was a direct look, more direct than usual, and she held it. "You're practical," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more like an observation. "Is that a problem?" "No." He paused. "I've had people try to comfort me in situations like this by telling me it'll all work out. It irritates me." "I know," Clara said. "I can tell." Something crossed his face. "How can you tell?" "You get a particular expression when someone says something you think is useless. You go very still, and you wait for them to stop." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife used to say the same thing." His voice didn't change when he said it, didn't soften or crack or do anything notable, but the room somehow felt different after the words were in it. Clara put down her mending. "What was her name?" "Helen." "Benjamin looks like her," Elias said after a moment. "Or I think he does. I have trouble sometimes remembering exactly, and that—" He stopped, turned the coffee cup on the table. "That's the part nobody talks about, the way the details go." Clara didn't try to fix that. There was nothing to fix about it. She just said, "I know." "How would you know?" "My mother," she said. "She's been gone 4 years. I can't remember the sound of her voice anymore, exactly. I remember the shape of it, not the sound." The wind pushed against the house. Elias said, I'm sorry. She was a good woman, Clara said. She cooked like someone who meant it. I got that from her, I think. He looked at the bread plate still on the table, the end of the loaf that hadn't been eaten. The bread today was... He paused. It reminded me of something. I couldn't place what. Clara looked at him. Good reminded or hard reminded? He thought about it with the seriousness he gave things when he wasn't performing. Both, he said. Same thing sometimes. She picked up her mending again. He sat there. The fire burned. The storm pressed against every side of the house with the impersonal force of something that had no awareness of the people inside it. At some point around midnight, Clara realized she was exhausted in the way that goes past tiredness into something almost meditative. Her hands were still moving with the needle, but her awareness had spread out to the room, to the fire and the wind and the particular rhythm of Elias's breathing across the table, which had slowed in the way that meant he was fighting sleep and losing. You could go to bed, she said. I'm all right. You're falling asleep in your chair. He straightened. I'm not. She said nothing. A few minutes later, his eyes closed again. She watched him. Not for long, just a moment. He looked different asleep. Not younger exactly, but less defended. The set of his jaw loosened and the lines of his face rearranged themselves into something less deliberate. She got up quietly and put more wood on the fire and pulled a blanket from the cedar chest in the sitting room and set it on the table next to his arm, where he'd find it if he reached for it. Then she went to check the north window rags, and the back window, and the kitchen fire, and when she came back through, Elias had shifted in the chair and the blanket had appeared over his shoulders. She didn't know if he was awake or asleep. She went to her room and lay down in the dark, still in her clothes, and listened to the blizzard and thought about a woman named Helen, whose voice she'd never heard, and her own mother's voice that she was losing by degrees. When she finally slept, the storm was still at it. She woke at 4 to silence. Not complete silence. The house was never fully quiet, but the storm's particular voice was gone. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. She lay there for a moment aware of it, the way you're aware of a noise stopping rather than starting. She got up, moved through the dark kitchen, and opened the back door a crack. The snow had drifted to the top of the porch railing on the east side. The sky was still deep black, heavy with clouds, but still. The world outside had the padded, sealed quality of deep snow everywhere, sound muffled, distances changed, the familiar landscape redistributed into shapes she'd have to learn again. And the barn. She could see the barn. The light was coming from under the barn door, a thin horizontal line of it, orange-yellow, moving slightly. Lamplight, which meant someone was in there. She stood at the door for a moment, the cold pressing in around her. Then she closed the door, put on her coat and boots, lit the small lantern she kept on the kitchen shelf, and went outside. The snow came to her knees in places. It took her longer than it should have to cross the yard. When she got to the barn and pushed the heavy door open, the warmth of it hit her immediately. Animal warmth and hay smell, and the orange light of a lamp hung on a post. Elias was crouched in one of the stalls, next to one of the young cows. The cow was standing but not right. Her legs spread too wide and her head down. He had his hands on the animal's side, and he looked up when Clara came in. The one that calved late, he said. His voice was flat and focused. She's in trouble. Clara came closer. She didn't know cattle medicine, Saras. That wasn't her knowledge. But she could see what he was working with. The cow was shaking. The calf from the fall was in the adjacent stall, small and frightened and making a sound that was barely sound. What do you need? Clara said. He looked at her. The lamp was between them and it lit the lower half of his face and threw the rest into shadow. He was exhausted. She could see it in the way he was holding himself, the effortful uprightness of a man who'd been awake past the point of good judgment and was running on will. I don't know yet, he said. She's not critical, not yet. I need to watch her. Then I'll stay. You don't need to... Elias. She said it the same way she'd said it before dinner 2 nights ago. He stopped. I'll stay, she said again. He didn't argue. She found a feed bucket, turned it over and sat on it against the wall of the stall. The cow's breathing was labored but rhythmic. The The calf moved in the next stall. Elias stayed crouched beside the cow, his hand on her flank, and the minutes moved slowly in the way they do when you're tired and the thing you're waiting for may or may not come. At some point, Clara said quietly, "She's warmer than she was." "Yeah." He looked at the animal. "I think she'll make it through." Clara nodded. They stayed for another hour in the barn. Neither of them spoke much. There wasn't much to say. The cow steadied. The calf stopped its crying and lay down. The lamp burned. Outside, the dark before dawn held everything in a kind of suspension, the storm-ravaged land settling into whatever it would become when the light came back. When Elias finally stood, his knees cracked audibly, and he grimaced and put his hand on the stall door to straighten up fully. "Thank you," he said, "for staying. You would have done the same." "That's not—" He paused. "That's not really the point." She looked at him in the lamplight. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the flatness, not the assessment, not the controlled courtesy he'd settled into over the past weeks. Something unguarded. Something that had gotten out while he wasn't watching for it. "Go inside," she said, not unkindly. "I'll come in after and start the coffee." He picked up the lamp and looked at her for another moment, and then he said, in a voice that had something different in it than she was used to, "I'm glad you're here." He left before she could answer. She heard his boots in the snow, moving toward the house. She stood in the dark barn with the animals, the warmth of them, the quiet that was left, and put her hand on the young cow's neck. The animal leaned into it slightly. Clara stood there in the barn, in the dark, in the cold, in the aftermath of everything, and she realized that the man who'd told her on the first day that she was not there to replace anything, not there to be part of anything, had just said the 4 words that undid the whole arrangement, and she had no idea what to do with them. But her hands were steady when she walked back through the snow toward the house, and the kitchen window was lit from inside, and somewhere in there Elias was starting the coffee before she could. He had the coffee going when she came back in. She stomped the snow off her boots on the porch and pushed through the kitchen door, and there he was, standing at the stove with his back to her, pouring water into the pot with the careful attention of a man doing a simple thing and meaning it. He didn't turn around when she came in. She hung her coat on the hook and pulled off her boots, and stood in her stocking feet on the cold kitchen floor for a moment before moving to the table. He set a cup in front of her without being asked. She wrapped her hands around it. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten at its lowest edge. Not sunrise yet, just the first suggestion that darkness was negotiable. The snow everywhere made it lighter than it should have been at this hour, the world outside the window a pale gray white that reflected what little light existed and gave it back doubled. They didn't talk right away. There was a particular quality to the silence between them now that hadn't been there before the storm, before the barn, before he'd said what he said in the lamplight and then walked away from it. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was aware of itself in a way it hadn't been previously. Elias sat down across from her with his own cup. He looked tired in the honest way. Not the controlled exhaustion he usually wore like armor, but the real kind, where the face stops performing and just is. "She'll make it," he said. About the cow, picking up from where they'd left off as though no time had passed. "Another day to be sure, but she's stable." "Good." Clara drank the coffee. It was strong, stronger than she made it, but she didn't say anything about that. "You didn't have to come out." "I know." "I mean it. In that snow, at that hour." "Elias." She set down the cup. "I came out because I wanted to. You can stop trying to give it back." He looked at her. The expression on his face was doing several things at once, none of which he seemed entirely in control of. "Give what back?" "The help. People do that sometimes. Someone does something for them, and they spend the next hour trying to reduce it to nothing. You don't have to do that." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd pushed too far. Then he said, "You're very direct." "So are you, when it suits you." Something pulled at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "Fair," he said. The coffee cooled between them, and the sky outside continued its slow negotiation with the light, and Clara felt the tiredness in her own bones settling in like a debt coming due. She'd slept maybe 3 hours. Her back ached from the feed bucket and her hands were still cold at the fingertips. I said something, Elias said. He was looking at the table. In the barn. Before I left. I remember. I didn't mean to say it that way. Clara looked at him. Which way did you mean to say it? He turned the cup on the table, once, then stopped himself doing it. I meant it, he said. I just didn't mean to say it like it meant something other than what it was. And what was it? He looked up. Gratitude. I'm grateful you're here. For the boys. He gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the house, the whole arrangement of things. All of it. Clara held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. All right? All right, it's gratitude. I understand. He seemed to be waiting for something more. When she didn't provide it, he nodded slowly and looked back at his cup, and she thought she saw something in his face that was either relief or its opposite, and she wasn't sure which one she was hoping for. The boys came down at 7. Benjamin saw the snow level and immediately wanted to go outside. Noah saw his father's face and asked about the cattle. Clara put eggs on, and the kitchen filled with the particular comfortable noise of a morning after a hard night. Voices, the scrape of chairs, the smell of food doing what it was supposed to do. She watched Elias with his sons across the business of breakfast and saw something she hadn't seen in the weeks before the storm. He was looking at them differently. Not softer, exactly. He wasn't a soft man, and pretending otherwise would have been false. But more directly. Like a man who'd been looking at things from an angle for a long time and had finally turned to face them straight. When Benjamin knocked over his milk and swore, a word that earned him a sharp look from his father, Elias leaned over and mopped up the spill with his own napkin without making it into a sermon. Benjamin looked surprised. Noah looked at his father with an expression that was careful and young and entirely unguarded, and Clara turned back to the stove so they wouldn't see her seeing it. The week after the blizzard had its own particular texture. The snow took 4 days to become passable, and during that time the 4 of them existed in the close quarters of the house in a way that was different from before. Before, the house had been a series of separate orbits, Elias in his, the boys in theirs, Clara in the kitchen, everyone moving around each other with the careful courtesy of people who'd agreed not to collide. The storm had compressed things, changed the geometry. Elias started eating breakfast at the table instead of standing at the counter. This sounds like a small thing, and Clara knew it was a small thing, and still she noticed it every morning, like it mattered, because it did, a little. Noah started talking during meals. Not constantly, not with the openness Benjamin had. Noah was constitutionally incapable of openness, it seemed, and that was fine. It was just who he was. But he asked questions now. About the land, mostly, directing them at his father with the careful precision of a boy who was still learning whether the channel was open. The first time it happened was really happened, not just a practical question about cattle or fences, but a genuine inquiry. Noah asking Elias how he'd decided to come to Wyoming in the first place. Clara saw Elias stop. A full stop, fork halfway to his plate. The question had come from nowhere in particular and landed somewhere significant. When I was about your age, Elias said slowly, my father took me to see the land maps at the county surveyor's office in Ohio. I don't know why he took me. He was looking into something else, I think. But I saw the Wyoming territory maps and I kept thinking about it. All that space. Noah was watching him with total attention. Took me until I was 24 to actually come, Elias said. I had reasons to stay and then I ran out of reasons and I came. Was it what you expected? Noah asked. Elias looked at his son and something in his face said that the question was landing on more than just geography. No, he said. It was harder and better. Usually the things that matter are both. Noah took that in, and Clara watched it land, and she thought about her own reasons for being here, ran out of reasons to stay anywhere else and came, and she thought there was probably something in that parallel she would have to sit with later when she had time to sit with things. The snow melted by degrees over the following week, uncovering the land the way you'd uncover something that had been in storage, familiar, but requiring reacquaintance. Elias was outside more, making up for the days lost. Clara kept the house and fed everyone and mended what needed mending and tried to hold very still inside herself about the things she'd noticed and couldn't unnotice. which was that the Varden Ranch had stopped feeling like an arrangement and started feeling like something else. She was in the kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, about 10 days after the blizzard, when Elias came in earlier than usual. She heard him on the porch and then the door, and then she heard him stop in the kitchen doorway and not come in. She turned around. He was holding a letter. Envelope already open. His face was the flattest she'd seen it in weeks, which was how she knew it was bad before he said anything. "What happened?" she said. He came in and sat down. He put the letter on the table and pressed his palm flat on top of it. "My brother," he said, "in Ohio. He's asking about the ranch, whether I want to sell." Clara sat down across from him. "Do you?" "No." Flat and immediate. "Then why does he look like he matters?" Elias looked up at her. "He says there's talk in Cheyenne about the ranch finances." He paused. "About whether I can keep it." Clara was very still. "He's heard from someone that I've had trouble the last 2 seasons. Which I have, it's not—" He stopped, started over. "The truth is, I have had trouble. The cattle losses last winter were significant. I've borrowed against the land twice. I'm not—" He pressed his palm harder on the letter. "I'm not in crisis, but I'm close enough to it that people talk." "What does he want?" "He wants to buy in, become a partner, which means I'd answer to him and to his money, and—" He shook his head. "I built this myself. I came out here with nothing, and I built it, and I won't—" He stopped. Clara looked at the letter and then at his hand on it, the knuckles white. "You have 2 options that I can see," she said. He looked up. She kept her voice even. "You take his money and keep the land but lose the independence, or you find another way through and keep both." She paused. "Which matters more to you?" "Both matter." "I know, but which one matters more?" He was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light was flat through the window, and somewhere outside one of the horses made a sound, and the house settled the way old houses do, adjusting to temperature. "The land," he said finally. "The independence?" He looked at his hands. "What I've built here." "Then we find another way through." He looked at her. "We." She heard it the moment she'd said it. She didn't take it back. "You and the boys," she said. "This place." He was watching her with an expression she was starting to learn. The one where he was taking something in rather than deflecting it, processing it somewhere below the level of words. "I appreciate that," he said carefully. "But this isn't your problem." "No," she said. "It isn't." She stood up and went back to the stove. "But I've been cooking your food for 2 months, and I know what it costs, and I know what you spend, and I think you're closer to fine than your brother wants you to believe." He was quiet. "The spring calving will help," she said, "if the cow from the barn is any indication of the condition of your stock." "How do you know about spring calving?" "Noah told me. He's been reading everything he can find about herd management. You should talk to him about it." He opened his mouth and she thought he was going to say something about the ranch or the letter or his brother, and instead he said, "Why does he talk to you about it and not me?" And there it was. The real thing. Clara turned from the stove. She picked her words carefully, not to protect him, but because the words mattered, and she wanted to get them right. "He's talked to you more this last month than he has in a long time," she said. "You know that. Not about things that matter. The almanac conversation mattered. Dinner last Tuesday when you told him about Wyoming mattered." She paused. "He's 11 and he lost his mother and he built a wall and he doesn't know how to take it down without losing something. He's like you." Elias flinched. It was small, just a tightening around the eyes. But she saw it. "I'm not criticizing you," she said. "I'm saying I see where he gets it from, and that's not nothing. He'll be all right. He just needs time and someone not taking the wall personally." Elias looked at the table. "I take it personally," he said, "that I don't know how to—" He stopped. "Don't know how to talk to them. I never did, really. Helen was the one who—" He shook his head. "I was better at the land than the people." "You're better at the people than you think." He looked up. "You sat in this kitchen all afternoon during the blizzard," she said. "You read with Noah in the sitting room 3 times this week. And you didn't make it into a lesson. You mopped up the milk yesterday without saying anything about it. She shrugged. That's all it is. That's what it looks like. He was very still. You don't have to be a different man, she said. You just have to keep showing up. She turned back to the stove, and the kitchen did what kitchens do. It kept going, the soup simmering, the fire working, the ordinary world continuing in its ordinary way. Behind her, she heard Elias pick up the letter, fold it, and put it in his pocket. Then she heard the chair push back. I'm going to write back tonight, he said. Tell him no. All right. He moved toward the door and then stopped. She heard him stop. Clara. She turned. He was looking at her from the doorway with the look that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite something else, and occupied the complicated space between them. What happened to you, he said. In Cheyenne. You've never said the whole of it. She'd been waiting for this without knowing she'd been waiting for it. She put down the spoon. I worked in a hotel kitchen, she said. 2 years. I was good at it. She told him the rest, Beaumont and Mrs. Farlow, and the $40, and the hair that wasn't even the right color, Hoffman looking away in the corridor, the 3 doors that closed before she could finish her sentence. She told it plainly, the way she'd told herself she would if she ever told it, without flinching and without asking for anything in particular from him in response. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. They just let it stand? He said. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. The owner knew the guest. I was easier to lose than she was. That's... He stopped himself. There was nothing you could do? No recourse I could afford, and my reputation was already gone. She looked at him steadily. I had 43 cents and a stagecoach fare and your advertisement on the community board. He looked at her for a long time. You should have said something, he said, when you arrived. And have you think I was coming here out of desperation? You were coming here out of desperation. Yes, but there's a difference between being desperate and being dishonest, and I needed you to know I was the first and not the second. He was quiet with that. It was the kind of quiet that meant he was going through something, rearranging something. You're not what I expected, he said. You're not what I expected either. The corner of his mouth moved, almost. What did you expect? Older, meaner, less complicated. This time he actually smiled, short and imperfect and gone quickly, but real. She'd seen it before, but rarely, and it still did something to the temperature of the room. I'm not mean, he said. I know you're not, she said. That took me about 2 weeks to figure out, but I got there. He laughed. A short sound surprised out of him, and he looked startled by the fact of it. Go write your letter, she said. He went. She stood in the kitchen alone and let out a slow breath and turned back to the stove. Her hands were entirely steady, which she considered a personal achievement. The letter to his brother went out with Thomas the following Saturday. Elias didn't tell her what he'd written, and she didn't ask. But she noticed he was lighter afterward in the way that people are when they've decided something they were afraid to decide. February arrived with cold that was cleaner than January's, drier, sharper, the kind of cold that didn't apologize for itself. The routine of the ranch had settled into something she could almost call comfortable if she was being honest with herself, which she was trying to be more often. Benjamin had graduated in the kitchen from stirring things and asking questions to being genuinely useful in the way that a child who pays attention eventually becomes. He could make biscuits himself now, not perfectly, but edibly, which was the only standard that mattered in a working kitchen. He had opinions about seasoning that were mostly wrong, but occasionally interesting, and he argued them with a conviction that Clara found genuinely entertaining. It needs more pepper, he said one afternoon, regarding a pot of chicken stew. It doesn't. I think it does. What's your evidence? He thought about it. It tastes like it needs something. That something might not be pepper. Taste it again. He tasted it again with the exaggerated gravity of a very small professional. Salt, he said finally. Yes. He looked pleased with himself in the specific way children do when they've worked something out honestly rather than been told. She handed him the salt and let him add it and watched him taste it again. Better, he said. The goal is not to make it more of something, she said. The goal is to make it what it's supposed to be. Benjamin thought about this. Is that just about cooking? She looked at him. He was 8 years old and entirely earnest, and she thought that sometimes 8-year-olds said the exact right thing without knowing they were doing it. No, she said. It's not just about cooking. He nodded as though she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Noah's progress was different and required a different kind of attention. He'd read her novel, finished it, she was sure of it, though he'd put it back without a word, and she'd only noticed because it was in a slightly different position than she'd left it. He'd also apparently gotten through most of the almanac and had moved on to a water management pamphlet that Elias had left on the shelf, which suggested a focused and particular appetite for practical information rather than narrative. She gave him her second book. She'd been holding it back. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because it was one of the two and felt more precious for that. But she left it on the kitchen table one morning with no note, and when she came back from the laundry it was gone. And that evening at dinner, Noah said, without preamble, "The woman in your book is stupid." Clara looked at him. "How far are you?" "About halfway." "Keep going, you'll change your mind." He considered that. Why is she letting him treat her like that? Because she thinks she deserves it. People do that sometimes. "That's stupid," he said again, but less certainly. "Yes," Claire said. "It is." She paused. Most people figure that out eventually, some faster than others. Elias was listening to this from his end of the table. When she glanced at him, he was looking at his plate, but the quality of his looking at his plate suggested he was doing something other than thinking about food. The conversation she'd been circling without approaching happened on a Saturday at the end of February, when the boys were out and the house was quiet and she was doing the week's baking, and Elias came in from the morning's work and sat down and didn't get up again. She knew the shape of it before it arrived, had known it was coming the way you know certain things, not from evidence exactly, but from the accumulated weight of many small things pointing in the same direction. He sat there while she worked, and the silence had the particular charge of something that was going to break. "I need to tell you something," he said. She kept her hands moving. "All right." "Before Helen got sick," he said, "we were—" He stopped, rearranged. "I wasn't always like this. The way I am now, I talked more. I was around more. The boys remember it different because they were young, but it was different." Clara set down the dough and turned to look at him. "When she died, I put everything into the ranch," he said. "Not because I loved it more than them. Because I didn't know what else to do, and the land required things, and the requirements were clear, and I could meet them." He looked at his hands. "The boys required things I didn't know how to give, and it was easier to be outside." She stayed quiet. This was not the moment to fill the space. "I know what I've been," he said. "These last 2 years. I'm not unaware of it." He looked up. "And I know something changed this winter. I know it, and I don't want to pretend it didn't or give it the wrong name." He held her gaze. "I don't know what it is exactly, but I know it's not the same as when you got here." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was warm. The bread smell was present. Outside she could hear the distant sound of the boys somewhere near the barn. "No," she said, "it's not the same. I'm not asking you to—" He stopped. "I don't know what I'm asking." "I know. Do you?" She picked up the dough again, not to avoid the conversation, but because her hands needed to be doing something, or she was going to say more than she was ready to say. "You're asking me to acknowledge it without making it into something you haven't offered," she said. "And I'm telling you I can do that, but I need you to understand something too." "What?" She turned and looked at him. "I've spent most of my life being careful about what I believe about people because the times I wasn't, things went badly. And I'm not being careful with your sons. I'm not being careful with this house. I stopped being careful somewhere in the last 2 months, and I need you to understand what that means." He was very still. "It means I'm not indifferent to what happens here," she said. "I can't afford to be anymore. And if you're telling me something, or starting to tell me something, I need it to be honest, because I'm—" She stopped. "I'm tired of being somewhere I'm not sure of my place." The kitchen held them both. "Your place," he said slowly, "is here." He said it like he was deciding it as he said it, like the words were creating the fact rather than describing one. Whatever else, I don't know yet. But that part I know. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. All right. All right. She turned back to the bread. Her chest was doing something complicated that she was going to have to deal with later in the quiet of her small room. Now, let me finish this, or we won't have anything to eat tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Then, can I help? She blinked, turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was almost self-conscious, which on Elias Varden was so unexpected it nearly undid her. You want to help make bread? I used to, he said. Before. A pause. Helen taught me. I've probably forgotten most of it. She considered him. Then she moved to the side of the table and made room. Wash your hands, she said, and I'll tell you what you've forgotten. He stood up and went to the basin and washed his hands and came back and stood beside her at the table and looked at the dough. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the actual physical warmth, and she kept her eyes on what she was doing. Like this, she said, and showed him the motion. He tried it. His hands were too heavy at first, too much force, and the dough pushed back wrong. Lighter, she said. He adjusted, tried again. Better. She watched his hands. He watched her hands, and the bread between them was clumsy in places, and probably wouldn't rise as evenly as it should have, and neither of them said a word about any of it, and the afternoon moved around them in its slow February way. And outside the boys were coming back toward the house, and the kitchen held everything it was supposed to hold. When Elias looked up from the dough and found her already looking at him, neither of them looked away. The bread rose anyway. Imperfectly, unevenly, with a crack along the top that wasn't supposed to be there. It was the best thing she'd made since she'd arrived. March came in the way it always does on the Wyoming frontier. Not gently, not with any particular regard for what people needed from it. The snow didn't disappear so much as it retreated, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, and holding in the shadows and low places. The land emerging from winter the way something emerges from a long illness. Unsteady, pale, not entirely sure of itself yet. Clara noticed she'd stopped counting weeks. She wasn't sure exactly when that happened. Somewhere between the blizzard and February's end, she'd stopped the mental arithmetic she'd been running since the first day. How long she'd been here, how much she'd saved, whether it was enough to go somewhere and start again if she needed to. She noticed the absence of the calculation before she understood what it meant. The way you notice a sound has stopped rather than starting. She was at the well one morning in early March, working the handle in the particular way it required, a half crank back before the full pull forward, something in the mechanism that needed managing. When she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her and looked up to find Elias standing a few feet away with his coat half buttoned and his hair uncombed, which meant he'd come out of the house before he'd finished his usual morning sequence of things. There's something I need to say, he said. She kept her hands on the well handle. Before coffee? Before I change my mind about saying it. She let the bucket finish its descent and turned to face him. The morning was cold but clear, the sky the specific blue that comes after prolonged winter, almost aggressively bright. His breath made small clouds in the air. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as Elias Varden, working himself toward something that didn't come naturally to him. I've been thinking, he said, about what happens in the spring. What about it? You've been here 4 months. The arrangement was open-ended, but he stopped, started differently. I don't want you to think that the arrangement is what it was when you got here, that you're here because I needed a cook, and that's the whole of it. Clara waited. Because it's not the whole of it, he said, and I think you know that, but I haven't said it plainly, and I should have. He looked at her steadily, the way he looked at things he was serious about. I don't want you to leave. The well creaked in the wind. Because of the boys, she said, testing the edges of it. Because of the boys, he said, and because of... He made a gesture that encompassed her, the well, the kitchen window, some larger territory. Because of this. What it's become. What has it become? He exhaled slowly. You're going to make me say the whole thing. I think you should say the whole thing. He looked at the sky for a moment, briefly, like he was recalibrating something. It's become home, he said. It wasn't before. Not really. It was a place I worked and fed the boys and survived in, and then you came and whatever you did, whatever it is you do, it became something I want to come back to. And that's, his jaw tightened slightly, that's you. That's what you did. Clara looked at this man, this difficult, weather-worn, imperfect man who said hard things badly and meant them entirely, and felt something move through her chest that she'd been keeping careful hands around for the better part of 2 months. Elias, she said, I'm going to need you to be specific. He looked pained in the way of a man who'd hoped that what he'd already said would be sufficient. About which part? About what you're asking. He met her eyes. I'm asking you to stay. Not as the cook. Not as the housekeeper. As... He stopped. The word seemed to cost him something. As my wife. If you'd consider it. If that's something you could... Yes, she said. He stopped. Yes, she said again, steadily, because he looked like he needed to hear it twice. He stood very still for a moment, like a man who'd expected more resistance and had run headlong into the absence of it. You didn't have to think about it? I've been thinking about it since January, she said. You're 4 months behind me. Something crossed his face, something genuine and unguarded and a little undone by the plainness of her answer. He wasn't a man who laughed easily, who opened easily, but what she saw in his face in that moment was something better than laughter. It was the look of a man who had stopped bracing for a blow and hadn't yet learned how to stand without the tension. She picked up the water bucket. Help me carry this in, she said, and you can tell the boys. He took the bucket from her hand. Their fingers overlapped on the handle for a moment, cold against cold, and neither of them made anything large out of it. They walked back to the house through the frozen morning mud, and the kitchen door opened onto the smell of the coffee she'd put on before coming outside. And somewhere in the house she could hear Benjamin talking at a volume that suggested he'd been up for a while and had opinions about something. It was ordinary. It was entirely ordinary. And it was, she thought, exactly enough. The boys took the news differently, which surprised no one who knew them. Elias told them at breakfast. Claire sat at the table and let him do it, which was right. It was his family and his sons and his doing, and she'd found that the best things she'd done in this house had been the things she'd stepped back from rather than toward. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, that he'd asked Clara to stay on as his wife, and she'd said yes, and he wanted them to know. Benjamin put down his fork, looked at Clara, looked at his father, and said, Are we still going to have biscuits? Yes, Clara said. Okay, Benjamin said, and picked his fork back up with the satisfaction of a child whose primary concern had been addressed. Noah didn't say anything for a long moment. His face did the complicated internal work it always did, and Clara watched him without watching him, the way she'd learned to give him room to process things without feeling observed. He was 12 now, had crossed the threshold from 11 to 12 sometime in January with very little ceremony, and the extra year seemed to have settled something in him, made him somehow both older and more accessible. He looked at his father. Did you want to? He said. Or did you think you should? Elias blinked. The directness of it, the very Eliasness of his son's question, seemed to catch him off guard. I wanted to, he said. Noah nodded slowly. Okay. He looked at Clara. Is that what you want? Not just... He struggled with something. Not because we need someone to cook and it's easier to stay. Noah, Elias said. No, it's a fair question, Clara said. She looked at Noah directly. It's what I want. Not because it's convenient, because I want to be here. Because your father is... She paused, picked the honest words rather than the easy ones. Because your father is a good man who's been hard on himself for a long time. And your brother is 8 years old and infuriating and funny, and you are smarter than you let most people see, and this house is the first place in years that's felt like it was worth something to be in. She held his eyes. That's the whole answer. Noah looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he said, very quietly, I was afraid you were going to leave. The kitchen was very still. When did you think I was going to leave? Clara said. In December, when you broke the bowl. He kept looking at the table. You had a look on your face, like you were done. She thought about that evening, the tiredness, the hot eyes, the weight of everything sitting on her at once. She hadn't known he'd seen it. I wasn't done, she said. I know, but I thought you might be. He looked up then, and on his face was the expression he almost never showed, the one underneath the watchfulness, the one that was just a boy who'd lost too much and was tired of losing things. I didn't want you to be done. Elias set down his coffee. He looked at his son with the look Clara had seen developing over the past 2 months, the one where he was still learning how to hold what he felt without either burying it or flinching from it. Neither did I, Elias said. It wasn't a grand moment. Nobody moved dramatically. Benjamin was already angling toward the biscuit plate, but something in the room settled, the way foundations settle. Not collapse, just a deeper seeding into the ground, more permanent than before. The weeks that followed were not without their difficulties, because nothing real ever is. There was the question of the practical arrangements, the letter that needed writing to the county to record the intention, the trip to Copper Creek for the brief and business-like ceremony that constituted a legal marriage on the Wyoming frontier in 1880. Clara wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was not saying a great deal. Elias wore a jacket she'd mended twice and hadn't told him about. The county clerk, a short man with impressive side whiskers, read the necessary words and they both said yes, and he stamped the paper, and that was largely that. On the way back to the ranch in the wagon, Benjamin asked if there was going to be a party. No, Elias said. We could have cake, Benjamin said. We don't need cake. Clara makes good cake. Benjamin, I'll make cake, Clara said. Elias looked at her sideways. It's a reasonable request, she said. It's unnecessary. Most of the things that make life bearable are unnecessary. She looked at the road ahead. I'll make the applesauce cake. It's not complicated and it uses up the dried apples before they go completely. He was quiet for a moment, then, fine. Benjamin pumped his fist in a motion that was probably not appropriate to the solemnity of the occasion, and then looked at Noah to see if this was acceptable, and Noah very carefully looked at the passing landscape and said nothing. The cake was made that evening. It wasn't much of a celebration by any external measure. The 4 of them at the kitchen table, the applesauce cake which was dense and good, coffee for the adults and warm milk for the boys. But there was something in the quality of the hour that Clara filed away without making a production of it. The lamp on the table, Benjamin getting frosting on his ear somehow, Noah eating 2 pieces and claiming to be unimpressed, Elias watching all of it with the look she'd first seen on his face during the blizzard, the look of a man encountering something he'd stopped believing was still available to him. She caught his eye across the table. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face said what smiling would have said, and she looked back at her cake, and that was enough. April brought the spring calving, which was brutal in the way all important work is brutal. Exhausting, relentless, beautiful in a manner that was entirely indifferent to how hard it was to be there for. The young cow from the blizzard had a second calf, healthy and aggressive about making her presence known. Elias worked 18-hour days for 2 weeks and came in smelling of hay and cold and the particular animal smell of new life, and Clara kept food warm for whatever hour he returned and didn't complain about it. Noah spent those 2 weeks as close to the calving as Elias would allow, which became closer as the weeks went on, and Elias found himself pointing things out rather than just working around the boy. Clara watched from the kitchen window one afternoon and saw Elias crouched beside a fence post explaining something to Noah, who was listening with the total attention he gave to things he considered worth his time. She didn't know what was being said, but she saw Noah nod, and she saw Elias put a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, and she went back to what she was doing before either of them looked up. It was also in April that the letter arrived from Cheyenne, not from Beaumont. She'd never expected to hear from Beaumont. From a woman named May Garrett, who had been a laundress at the Meridian Hotel and had heard, through the particular underground of people who did essential unseen work and therefore knew everything, that Clara had left the territory entirely. The letter was short. May had direct and slightly aggressive handwriting, as though she'd learned to write against resistance. I thought you should know. Mrs. Farlow came back to the hotel in February, couldn't keep her story straight about the money. Turned out her nephew took it. Beaumont knows. He's not saying so publicly because that would require admitting he was wrong about you. And you know how men like Beaumont feel about admitting things. But Hoffman knows, and I wanted you to know, that people here know you didn't take anything. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. She sat with it at the kitchen table in the early morning when no one else was up, the stove newly lit, the house in the particular quiet of a family asleep. She read it twice, and then set it down flat on the table and looked at it. She'd spent a long time being careful with the anger she felt about Cheyenne, keeping it in its place, not letting it take up too much space because she couldn't afford the space it would need. The practical requirements of survival had given her somewhere to put her attention instead, and she'd been grateful for that. But sitting here now, in this kitchen that had become hers, in this house that had become hers with this family sleeping in the rooms around her, she let herself feel it for a moment. The full size of what had been done to her by a man who'd found it easier to believe a lie than to protect someone who worked for him. The 2 years of building something real, and the way it had been taken in an afternoon. She felt it. She let it be as large as it actually was. Then she folded the letter and held it in both hands and thought about what she would have been if none of it had happened. Still in Cheyenne, still in someone else's kitchen, building someone else's reputation, saving money towards something she hadn't quite been able to picture. She would never have come here. She would never have met 2 boys who needed someone to show up and stay. She would never have learned that an imperfect man's first real smile could do something inconvenient to a woman's composure. She would never have found out that she was capable of making a home out of bare materials and sheer stubbornness, which turned out to be the most useful thing she'd ever discovered about herself. She didn't forgive Beaumont. She wasn't built for that kind of neat resolution, and she'd stopped believing it was required. Some things you carry forward without forgiving them, just lighter than you carried them before. But she thought she understood something she hadn't before. That the worst thing that had ever happened to her had also been the crack through which everything she actually wanted had eventually come. Not because suffering was good, it wasn't, but because sometimes the locked door and the kicked out into the cold and the 43 cents in your pocket was the only thing that would ever get you to Wyoming, and some things you can't find by looking for them. Elias came in at 5:30. He stopped when he saw her at the table. "Up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She tucked the letter into her apron pocket. She'd tell him about it later. Not now, not before coffee. He built the fire up and put the coffee on and came and sat across from her. And there was no strangeness in it. The 2 of them at the table before the house woke, before the day required anything of them. It had become the part of the day she looked forward to most, which was either ordinary or remarkable, depending on how you thought about such things. "Calving's almost done," he said. "Another week, maybe." "How are the numbers?" "Better than I hoped. Lost 2, kept everything else." He looked at his hands, ranch hands, scarred and thick-knuckled and completely honest about the life they'd done. "It's going to be a better year." "I know." He looked up. "How do you know?" "Because you decided it would be." She poured his coffee. "You write to your brother again?" "Last week. Told him the spring numbers. Told him the loan is being serviced." He paused. "He didn't write back. He will eventually. He'll find another angle." "And?" "And I'll tell him no again." He said it without heat, without performance. Just a fact about himself he'd settled into. "He doesn't understand what this is. He thinks it's land and cattle. He's never understood that it's—" He looked around the kitchen, the window, the stove, the ordinary arrangement of things. "It's more than that." Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." In June, Noah asked if he could take over the books. This was not as unexpected as it might have been 6 months ago. He'd been watching Elias work through the ranch ledgers for 2 months, asking questions with the particular focused patience of someone who was building toward something. He was 12, nearly 13, which was not too young on the frontier for a boy to begin learning the real workings of a piece of land he would one day be responsible for. Elias looked at him across the ledger. You think you can manage it? I think I can learn to. There's a difference. I know the difference, Noah said. I'm saying I want to learn. I'm not saying I already know. Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at his son with the look that had been developing all year, the one that saw Noah fully, not as a smaller version of what he was supposed to become, but as what he already was, a serious, precise, unexpectedly determined person who happened to be 12 years old. All right, he said, we'll go through it together. Noah sat down at the table with the ledger and didn't say anything more, just opened it and looked at the columns with the focused expression of someone beginning something that mattered. And Elias sat beside him and pointed to the first line and started explaining. Clara found the two of them still at the table an hour later when she came in to start dinner. She moved around them without comment, the ledger between them, Elias's voice low and specific, Noah's questions careful and exact. Benjamin wandered in at some point and looked at them and then looked at Clara with an expression that asked if this was significant. She handed him a potato to peel. Is this boring? He whispered. Ledgers? Numbers. To some people, she said quietly. Not to Noah. Benjamin peeled the potato with the deep personal reluctance he brought to all tasks that didn't involve food already in progress. What am I going to be good at? He said, in the tone of someone who had been thinking about this privately. Clara looked at him. He was 8, nearly 9, with flour perpetually somewhere on his person and opinions about seasoning that had moved from mostly wrong to sometimes right. She thought about who he was, the cheerful tenacity, the genuine curiosity, the way he'd eaten 2 helpings of soup on that first night before anyone else had decided to trust her. You're already good at things, she said. Like what? Like knowing when a room needs warming up. Like asking the question everyone else is afraid to ask. She handed him another potato. Like tasting something and knowing what it's missing. He thought about this. That's not a job. It's the most important part of every job. She looked at him. The rest can be learned. What you already are can't be taught. He chewed on this, literally and figuratively, and then said, I want to learn to make the applesauce cake myself. The whole thing. Next Saturday, she said. You'll let me do all of it? I'll watch. You'll do. He straightened up with the self-possession of someone who has been given responsibility and intends to take it seriously, and went back to peeling, and Clara turned to the stove and thought that sometimes the simplest conversations were the ones that stayed with you longest. Summer filled the ranch in the way summers did, sudden, generous, almost aggressive after the long gray of winter. The land turned green in the draws and gold on the open slopes, and the cattle moved through it with the ease of creatures doing what they were built for. The days were long, and the work was long with them, and the evenings came slow and warm and full of the particular quality of summer evenings in open country, the sky enormous and unhurried above the hills. Clara planted a kitchen garden in the south-facing strip along the house. This was not a small undertaking. The soil was hard and not naturally generous, and it took more work than she'd accounted for, but she had the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided a thing is worth doing and is not going to be argued out of it by dirt. Elias watched the project from a careful distance for about a week, offering no opinions, and then appeared one morning with a pickaxe and worked the hardest section of ground without being asked, and without making anything of it. You didn't have to, she said. The soil's bad here, he said. You need to go deeper or nothing will take. I know. I was planning to. With what? She looked at the pickaxe. I'd have figured it out. He kept working. I'm sure you would have. The garden came up in July, imperfectly, with some rows thicker than others and one section where something had gotten into the early seedlings and done damage. But it came up. Beans and onions and squash and herbs that Clara's mother had always kept, the seeds of which she'd been carrying in a small paper packet in the bottom of her travel bag since she'd left Ohio at 23. She planted them in Wyoming soil in July of 1881 and watered them every morning and thought about her mother's handwriting in the recipe book, the round, careful letters of a woman who'd taught herself late. Bean soup, Sunday bread, the things you make when you mean it. The herbs came up thin but fragrant, and when she cut the first ones and brought them into the kitchen and the smell filled the room, She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed and felt the specific texture of something that had been missing being present again, and she didn't say anything about it to anyone because it was hers. She told Elias that night, though, in the particular quiet they'd made their own. The late hour, the boys in bed, the lamp on the table. "My mother's herbs came up," she said. He looked at her. "In the garden? I brought seeds from Ohio. I've had them for years." She looked at her hands. "I didn't plant them anywhere before this. I don't know why." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe you were waiting for somewhere worth planting them." She looked at him. He said things like that sometimes, when he wasn't trying to say anything. Things that were more true than he seemed to know. "Maybe," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything more. She didn't either. Outside, the summer night pressed warm against the windows, and somewhere out in the dark the land was doing its slow, patient work of being itself. This was what she'd found. Not rescue. She'd rescued herself by 43 cents and sheer refusal to disappear. Not a perfect family, because no such thing had ever existed. Not a story that resolved itself cleanly and made the hard parts make sense. What she'd found was this: a table in a kitchen on a Wyoming ranch, with two boys sleeping down the hall who needed someone to stay and had gotten someone who knew how. A man beside her who was learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be in a room with his own life. A garden with her mother's herbs in it. A recipe book that had traveled from Ohio and come to rest on a shelf in Copper Creek like it had always been heading here. The woman who'd arrived with nothing had been wrong about what nothing meant. She hadn't arrived with nothing. She'd arrived with everything she'd managed to save from the wreckage, which turned out to be the only things that couldn't be taken. The knowledge in her hands, the stubbornness in her spine, the capacity to make a cold house warm and to stay in it when it would have been easier to leave. You can lose your name. You can lose your wages and your reputation and the life you'd built in someone else's kitchen. You can stand in the street with 43 cents and the right story being told about you and the wrong story on everyone's lips, and it can feel like the end of something. But Clara Whitmore had learned what the end of something actually felt like. It felt like Hoffman looking away in the corridor. It felt like a door shut in your face before you finished your sentence. This, the lamp on the table, the hand over hers, the sleeping house, the herbs that had finally found their ground, this felt like the opposite of ending. She turned her hand over under his and held on. Outside, the Wyoming summer went on being itself, enormous and indifferent and full of every kind of weather, and the Varden Ranch sat in the middle of it, lamps burning, doors solid against the wind, the smell of something good always present in the kitchen. Not perfect, not easy, not a life that had resolved into neatness, just real, just hers, just enough, and then some.